Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Book 2 of Aristotle's Politics. So Book 2 begins with its statement of purpose. He starts here by saying, since we propose to study which political community is best of all for people who are able to live as ideally as possible, we must investigate other constitutions too, both some of those used in city-states that are said to be well-governed and any others described by anyone that are held to be good, in order to see what is correct or useful in them, but also to avoid giving the impression that our search for something different from them results from a desire to be clever. Let it be held instead that we have undertaken this inquiry because the currently available constitutions are not in good condition. So essentially, the purpose of Book 2 is to go through the existing constitutions or philosophies of constitutions, and really Aristotle is more interested in that. He's more interested in responding to what other people have said about good constitutions than he necessarily is in this book to talking about existing constitutions. So he starts with the constitution laid out in Plato's Republic and in Plato's Laws, and that's dealt with in chapters 2 through 6. So there's an extensive amount of response to Plato's conception of the ideal constitution for a city-state. Starting in chapter 2 with the idea of the problem of unity in a city-state, because as Aristotle summarizes or glosses Plato's argument in the Republic, the city-state should focus on building unity, a collection in which everybody has a shared interest. The problem Aristotle finds with this is that basically people don't have a shared interest in a city-state. When you create the kinds of divisions that Socrates creates in Plato's Republic, that inherently creates divisions within the city-state as people have competing interests. So this is one issue Aristotle raises. The other issue in terms of unity, the unity principle in Socrates, is that the more united a particular form of governance becomes, the less political it becomes. As it becomes more and more unified, it moves toward being a household or even toward being an individual in Aristotle's classificatory scheme. Because inherently for Aristotle, the polis is a multitude. It's made up of a lot of different pieces, a lot of different parts. So we've got that element. Then Aristotle brings up, over the course of chapters 2 through 6, a lot of practical problems with the way that Socrates conceptualizes the Constitution. And these are some of the ones that I talked about in my various videos about Plato's Republic as well. For instance, in chapter 5, Aristotle says, "But the fact is that Socrates has not said, nor is it easy to say, what the arrangement of the Constitution as a whole is for those who participate in it. The multitude of the other citizens constitute pretty well the entire multitude of his city-state, yet nothing has been determined about them. Whether the farmers too should have communal property, or each his own private property, or whether their women and children should be private or communal. If all is to be common to all in the same way, how will they differ from the guardians? And how will they benefit from submitting to their rule? Or what on earth will prompt them to submit to it unless the guardians adopt some clever stratagem?" So this is a big problem in Plato's Republic. Socrates spends a lot of time talking about the education of the guardians, how their property will be dispersed, how they should rule, how they should think, etc., etc. And he spends virtually no time talking about what we might broadly call the working class, farmers, craftspeople, etc., etc. Almost nothing actually mentioned about how their lives would work under this constitution. And so Aristotle's critique here is that's the majority of the people in the city-state. You've devoted all of your time and energy in the Republic to talking about a tiny fraction of the people in this city-state, and there's virtually no real discussion of how this constitution would apply to everyone else. And these are the kinds of things that that Aristotle tends to discuss in terms of the constitutions that other people have created are these practical problems. Here's why it wouldn't work in practice. Now, sometimes this is a bit of an unfair system because Aristotle does sometimes fall into the same kinds of problems that people like Plato fall into or Socrates fall into in the Republic, which is that he takes certain things to be self-evident, and he doesn't necessarily provide effective proof for those assumptions. So that's a drawback of pretty much all ancient Greek philosophy, including Aristotle's politics. But he also makes legitimate critiques of other existing ideas about ideal constitutions. So I want to tell you about just two more of them, because I think these sort of represent interesting ones. So in chapter 7, Aristotle talks about the constitution of Philip of Chalcedon. Basically, the idea that Philip has is that everything should be divided equally. Karl Marx would love this guy. So he says here, this is why Philip of Chalcedon, the first to propose such a constitution, did so, for he says that the property of the citizens should be equal. He thought that it was not difficult to do when city-states were just being founded, but that in those already in operation it would be more difficult. Nonetheless, he thought that a leveling could very quickly be achieved by the rich giving but not receiving dowries, and the poor receiving but not giving them. So this is a leveler, basically, in the sense of like the English Civil War era political and religious movement, the levelers who believed in social equality, a leveling of wealth. Aristotle, however, does not think this would work. He points out one particular problem, which is that the rich, when they become unrich, tend not to be super thrilled with that. And so you create a potentially revolutionary faction when you level wealth by taking from the wealthy and giving to the poor. Now, this is obviously a potential problem anytime you do any sort of social justice or socioeconomic equality project. And this is part of the reason why the rich spend so much money in the US, for instance, trying to convince us that we don't want universal health care, even though the data is unequivocally in favor of that working better and more economically efficiently, et cetera, et cetera. So these kinds of things. But he also points out other practical problems with this idea of the equal distribution of property. So Aristotle says here, it was the abrogation of this provision, to cite one example, that made the constitution of Lucaeus too democratic, since as a result men no longer entered office from the designated assessment classes. But equality to property may exist, and yet the amount may be too high, so that it leads to luxurious living, or too low, so that a penny-pinching life results. It's clear then that it is not enough for the legislator to make make property equal. He must also aim at the mean. Yet even if one is prescribed a moderate amount for everyone, it would be of no use, for one should level desires more than property, and that cannot happen unless people have been adequately educated by the laws. So we've got here one thing that's very, very central to Aristotle's philosophy that we see consistently across his works, the idea of the golden mean, the idea that things should be balanced in order to work most effectively and to be most ethical. So that idea that wealth doesn't just need to be even, it needs to be even at the right level. But then the other component that we have here is this question of how you get a society to run that depends on people to be actively engaged when everyone is sort of equal. How do you, he says here, equality of as a result, men no longer entered office from the designated assessment classes. And this is a problem that Aristotle brings up elsewhere in the Politics, which is that you can motivate the rich to participate in the civic life and political life of the polis through fines. If you don't participate, if you don't do the task you are elected to do or selected to do or whatever it is, we will fine you. You can motivate the poor by paying them. If you do this thing, we will pay you to do it. And this seems to be a system Aristotle is in favor of, generally speaking. When you level out finance to make everybody equal, that becomes much, much harder to do. So again, he deals with these sort of practical problems. And then the last of the constitutions in Book 2 that I want to talk about is in Chapter 8, where Aristotle talks about the constitution of Hippodomus of Miletus. And basically, this is built on this sort of three-part society system. He says, the city-state he designed had a multitude of 10,000 citizens divided into three parts. He made one part the craftsmen, another the farmers, and a third the defenders who possessed the weapons. He also divided the territory into three parts, sacred, public, and private. That which provided what is customarily rendered to the gods would be sacred, that off which the defenders would live, public, and the land belonging to the farmers, private. He thought that there were just three kinds of laws, since the things lawsuits arise over are three in number: arrogant behavior, damage, and death. He also legislated a single court with supreme authority. We go on from there and get a little bit more detail about this. Basically, Aristotle is making, again, practical critiques here of how this would actually run. Issues like who would actually work the public land that in principle belongs to the defenders? Because if they are the defenders, if they are the military, they aren't necessarily going to be good farmers. And if the farmers have to work both their own private land and the public land in order to feed the defenders, what's going to motivate the farmers to do that? Because that's twice as much labor, etc., etc. So there's that element of it. There's also this issue that dividing society into three equal shares doesn't necessarily make that much sense. You can have a smaller class of craftspeople, for instance, because you don't necessarily need as many shoemakers and potters as you do farmers. Like, because farming produces food more slowly than a potter or a shoemaker or a blacksmith or whatever it is can make things, it doesn't necessarily make that much sense to have them be equal in number. So again, there's this weird element of it seems balanced, but in practice, it's not an effective way of running a city-state. So this is essentially what Book 2 is all about, is Aristotle. This is a lit review, in a way. Like, if you want to think about it that way, in terms of, like, he's doing his scholarly homework here and saying, these are the things that other people have said about how to run an ideal constitution. These are their strengths. These are their weaknesses. From that basis, I'm going to move on and tell you about my ideal constitution, which is what he does throughout the rest of Politics.